Hello,
Hello there. Hi
Rod,
there.
Michael. Good to see you guys today. Hello to our audience. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. I wanted to first say hello and welcome to our Reliable webinar series. This is all about reliable leadership. And during these live events, the founding partners of Relia Healthcare, Dr. Rod Brace and Dr. Michael Shabbat, join me, Frank Dana, as we get a chance to connect with leaders from a wide variety of organizations about reliable leadership, high reliability teams, and high reliability organizations, and what it takes to build truly reliable, inclusive, and zero harm workplace cultures. So today, we've got a special guest. His name is Josh Ettinger from Kaiser Permanente. And we're hoping to have Josh join us. We're having some technical difficulties, but we really wanted to talk through the approach that strategy and reliable leadership has and kind of how those intermingle and interconnect. So if Josh isn't able to join us today, we're still going to have a great discussion and it's going to work totally. Technology is our best friend, right, Rod Michael?
Exactly. We see, and you may see viewers, Josh attempting to come in and out. We've had several fails early on getting his internet to connect up. So we're not quite sure what's going on. But if we do get him in, we'll include him in the conversation. But primarily, as Frank said, the object of these webinars is to really take a deeper dive into leadership as it pertains to being within a high reliability organization. And so as high reliability organizations, nuclear plants, nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, and healthcare systems, obviously each of those have a strategy to them. And strategy is one of those things that one is oftentimes, I think, misunderstood in an organization, but two can be misapplied in an organization. And a lot of times it becomes something that it was never intended to be. And so one of the things we want to unpackage for you today is what is strategy in a high reliability organization? How can you improve that? What are some challenges and some missteps that you can avoid? And then in the end, how can all this be used to reach a higher level of high reliability? We remind you that high reliability is a journey. It's not anything that any organization can put up a sign and we've achieved it. It's something that all of us have to continue to strive forward. And so with that as the context, we'll, Frank, go for it here with or without Josh.
I think that's great. I think let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the base. What are some of those misconceptions about strategy and really the idea of what strategic planning is in general?
Yeah, so Michael and I are old guys, and we've been around organizations for a long time. We are, yeah, we are retired. And we've seen various iterations of this, but Michael, I would say the one that I've seen the most is just this checkbox mentality that we're all going to come together in a big conference room once a year, and we're going to put up some slides about here's what's happening in our competitive arena, here's what's happening in the industry, and maybe we'll break out into a few small groups to let people talk about it and then come back and present. But it's really not strategy in the sense that maybe we would have seen applied at Apple, where it would just totally reinvigorate and reinvent the organization. But it's almost one of those things where we sort of gave tacit approval as everybody in the room. Nobody really spoke out with any innovative thoughts because largely it oftentimes comes down to it's not the time or place to really push back and with a great deal of transparency to say, raise your hand and say, Mr. CEO, Mr. President, I think we've been on the wrong track here and I think we need to do this or that. But Michael, what's your experience with some of those check the box meetings?
Well, there are too many of those, but I do want to tie this back to our concept of reliable leadership. When I was at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, I co-chaired the 5-year strategic planning committee for the next 5-year plan, along with another member of the board. I was chief of staff at the time, and although we did some very good work on planning for the next 5 years, I would have to attribute the success in those 5 years to reliable leadership at the top. A CEO who had been CEO for many years and who still continues to be CEO 14 years after I left Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. That is actually key. Setting the tone for the organization and helping set the tone for the strategic plan, but in fact carrying it out really requires what we call reliable leadership. And that's the key, as Rod mentioned, to the high reliability journey as well. If your board and your CEO and your C-suite leadership are not reliable leaders, you'll never, ever get to high reliability patient care.
Wow.
But looks like we may have established a connection with the infamous Josh Ettinger. Josh, can you hear us?
I can. Am I breaking up?
No.
Oh,
Yeah.
great.
You look great. You
You-
sound great.
Sound okay?
Yeah.
You're good.
Perfect.
So, Josh, we are live. And so we've started this discussion around just maybe some of the misconceptions about strategic planning, how people treat it as a checkbox sort of activity in some organizations. But if you like, maybe share some of your experiences as to what have been good strategic planning experiences and what are some misconceptions about strategic planning?
I'm sorry. It's all breaking up on my end over here. I got about every third word. I apologize. Maybe I don't want to be a distraction for the group. So maybe I'll drop out. I don't want to cause an issue. Can't hear the question all that well, unfortunately.
Okay, sure.
Apologize.
No problem.
Josh, I wanted to.
I was just wondering if there was a way for us to relay it in the chat here, but
Yes. I dropped it into the chat for Josh. I'm not sure if you can hear us, but I did put the question in the private chat in StreamYard. Oh, all right.
Maybe I'll try again. We'll see.
It's totally fine. So it's interesting as we talk about strategy and strategic planning. You know, when we're talking about these objectives from organizations and trying to achieve these desired outcomes and objectives, what you were saying, Rod, is that most of the time these meetings don't really push the envelope on trying to get to the point where I'm just wondering, like, are things trying to be improved, or just, it sounds like a lot of these strategic conversations are very status quo and keeping things moving forward without ruffling feathers or pushing the envelope or anything like that.
yeah, I think you've got a couple dynamics at play. One is there's this perhaps too much deference to senior leaders of an organization, believing that only they have the right answers, only they can come up with the strategies. And so for me to speak up in a meeting, I may be going against. I don't want public humiliation when they tell me that's a bad idea in front of my colleagues at this meeting. I think the other thing that you have going on is that if you think about it, oftentimes we change strategy, but we don't ever change the organizational roles. And so an analogy might be, and I'm terrible with sports analogies, but let's say that you're a football coach, pro level, and you decide you're going to implement a different offensive strategy or a different defense. Well, you would step back and you say, well, the roles in that defense really have to change. So either we've got to bring players in that can play into those roles, or we have to retrain the people that we're going to keep to play in different roles. Well, the same applies to organizations where we'll create a totally different strategy, but we don't ever change the roles that are going to deploy that strategy. And so it really then just gets added on to everybody else's responsibility. And so if you use that as the context of this meeting, if I suggest a new strategy in this meeting, then perhaps my role will change and perhaps I may not even be with the organization anymore. And so there's a little bit of a career risk to change. I would prefer you just add a few more goals to my plate, and I'm going to try to do the best I can, but I still have my job. Well, what ends up happening is people are not fully bought into the new strategy. They're not fully trained in the role of deploying for that strategy. And strategy becomes just this thin layer of bureaucracy in the organization that just gets put on everybody else's plate.
I'm wondering what the difference is then in a high reliability organization, or when a reliable leader is the CEO or the overarching kind of creator of this strategy, or bringing the strategy to the table. What is that conversation like? What is that meeting like when you're in those types of discussions versus this other check the box style meeting?
Yeah, let me speak up a little bit here. And that reliable leader will have created an atmosphere where thoughts will come forward without fear of being dismissed or being silly, or coming from how would a nurse come up with that idea? You know what I mean? When the nurses are actually the ones taking 98% of the care of patients in the hospital and know how the actual flow of work goes in a hospital. I mean, it's one of the reasons that as a trend in healthcare, many former chief nursing officers are becoming chief operating officers, because they actually manage most of the operations of the hospital. So being able to speak up in the room, that's something that only the leadership can enable. If they suppress it or dismiss it, others will not speak up. You will have a very quiet meeting. You'll only have whatever the dogma is of the organization come forward, and you really won't do creative strategic planning. Again, that's got to come from reliable leadership.
There's also a principle of high reliability. One of the 5 principles is this deference to expertise. And so if you create a strategic planning process that provides that deference to expertise, the people that are actually face-to-face with the consumer, face-to-face with the patient, they're dealing with the challenges of doing work, they are in a good position to sort of know the heartbeat of what's going on in the business. They're in a good position to hear from consumers what they really want. And so a reliable leader is one who really pushes that down into the organization, gets down to that level of actually someone that's experiencing the work, experiencing the consumer, and getting that input. It really is a defense against what you may have heard is the hippo effect, which is the highest paid person's opinion is the one that counts in these meetings. And so when reliable leaders step away from being the hippo in the room and not portray themselves as the person having all the answers, having ownership of the strategy, but getting it down in the organization, there's a great deal of transparency. And certainly in healthcare knows, leaders know that a high reliability organization comes and must be arm in arm with a just culture. And so a just culture means that we're going to have that transparency. It's going to be non-punitive for me to speak up and provide these strategic ideas. And as a result, we get a better conversation. I think one of the things that's lacking in many organizations we work with as it comes to strategy is just a lack of deep, honest, transparent conversation around who we are, what we're doing, and where we need to head in the future.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and have seen that, especially at Softway. And Softway is a technology company that transforms workplace culture. And so, we're constantly looking at strategy evolving and changing, especially with the needs of our customers and new technologies emerging. And we've kind of come upon this term that we use when we talk about responsible leadership and reliable leadership, and we call that responsible transparency. And the idea is that we're willing to be transparent, but making sure that it doesn't ebb into the side of toxic transparency, where all of the information is provided like a fire hydrant of information, and you're leaving people without context or clarity. But reliable leaders are responsibly transparent. They're the ones who understand the situations that are happening. They're thoughtful, they're clear, and they're very deliberate with their approach to communicating with individuals. And they're also willing to help and ask for encouragement or advice from team members, like you mentioned, that are on the floor and that contribute to that conversation. Yeah. So
have you all,
responsible transparency is vital.
Have you all deployed technology in interesting ways to sort of encourage strategic planning in software?
I think one of the ways that we have done this is a very iterative approach to our deployment of technology and the projects that we're working on. And one of those ways is by consistently updating and improving our content based on feedback. And so we'll deploy technology and then create iterative approaches to making sure that the actual technology is working for the right people. And it's just like any consumer product, right? You receive that information and you recognize that the thing you're making is not complete. It's not done. And so we're constantly thinking through and listening to what people are telling us and how we can greatly improve or retool based on that feedback. So internally, we're making sure that our team members can communicate as frequently as possible about the work that we're doing, not just the products we're creating, but also the things that we're trying to accomplish within Softway.
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges in healthcare is to get that real-time knowledge that you just described. I think there are so many moving parts. There are any health system has many thousands of policies and procedures. They have many inputs, and oftentimes it's maybe not even people are fearful to bring that information forward. They just don't have time. I mean, if we were able to sit down with a group of nurses who were treating patients day in and day out and just, spend a day as a leader, understanding their life, understanding how our strategy is being deployed at the bedside, I think it really would be a good exercise for healthcare leaders to take that time apart from just the big hooray conference room meeting of we're going to do strategy today, and get the voice of the people who are actually doing the work into these sessions. It's hard to do because everybody's busy and there's literally thousands of those employees, but that is a takeaway, I think, for healthcare leaders as they pursue high reliability, is that you have to be out and about. You have to, oftentimes said when I was still in healthcare leadership, is that the office is the least productive space in the organization, that we really learn more about being out and about with our team members, and that helps us formulate strategy, because strategy is equally important in sort of overcoming operational barriers as it is with marketing and growing market share and things like that.
So you're suggesting that strategy should not just come from people at the very top, but it should be inclusive of all of the voices of an organization.
Right.
And that kind of, instead of top down, that bottom up approach is a little bit different than what most people would assume when you're talking about strategic planning.
Yeah, I think so. I see in healthcare, we see this with some of our clients. There's a little bit of Me Too that goes on, that our competitor developed a center of excellence, so then me too, I have to do that. And so there's a lot of following the leader that happens in strategy, and it's less dependent upon what are the needs of the community, what are the resources that we have as an organization, but it's more, I don't want to be left out. I have to have a cardiac center of excellence. Well, maybe you do, or maybe you don't. And so understanding that really has to go not only down operationally, what strengths do we have by talking to our employees. Rarely in a strategic discussion do we talk about barriers. As you know, Frank, we describe employee engagement as making daily progress towards meaningful work. And so one of the barriers to an effective deployment of strategy is inability to make daily progress on that. And so how do we understand those? How do we talk to the patients? How do we understand what the community needs are? And too much of it is just, I look around and I see what other people are doing. And, frankly, it's one of the reasons a lot of we as healthcare leaders will go to conferences so that we can understand what other people are doing and bring those ideas back home. That's fine. But they have to apply. And then if they are applicable, we do have to have the ability to resource them with the functions and structures of the organization.
Yeah.
Let me chime in a little bit here. One of the principles of high reliability is sensitivity to operations, meaning understanding what's happening on the front line. And one of the great leaders of U.S. Airlines was Herb Kelleher and Southwest Airlines. And you probably know the stories that Herb didn't spend all of his time in the exec office, especially on holidays. He spent time in operations, loading and unloading baggage with the baggage handlers and serving at the front desk at airports, and basically living the life of his employees. He was recognized as within not only his own company, but within the industry as a true leader, as an upstanding leader. And it really harks back to the principles that Rod was just talking about.
And obviously he was a great risk taker, and I think part of strategic development is taking a risk. I think one of the interesting outcomes perhaps of the pandemic is that a lot of healthcare leaders were forced to look at how they provided service, forced to look at how they staff services. And so on occasion, we will see things that really, if we say strategy is determining how we're going to serve the needs of our constituency, right. There were many needs that were rapidly deployed in the pandemic, telehealth being one of them, online visits, that it really took a pandemic to push us as healthcare leaders there quickly. And so strategy does require some risk. Strategy does require that we're going to have some forces that are disruptive in our organization. But if nothing else, the pandemic should demonstrate to us, one, we can do those things quickly, and two, we shouldn't need a pandemic to sort of force us to be in a position to take action on those. There's a lot of work out there in the healthcare community that we need to have solutions for. And how do we provide home care? There's certainly a trend right now of hospital at home, and we're actually working with some companies that are putting that in place. And I always share the story with them that probably as far back as 10 years ago, while I was in an executive position in a large health system, I had two physicians come to me who had started a company that actually they contended that they could take care of 60% of those patients that were discharged from the emergency room. They could take care of them at home. They had the technology in place, they had the personnel in place, and the only reason that their company couldn't really survive and thrive is the lack of reimbursement. It was just the models in place were not there, and those are still some states currently have a waiver in place where some of those home health hospital at home services can be provided, but it would be very easy for those waivers to go away. And then that strategy, which is really serving patients in a way that they'd like to be served, could fall by the wayside. And so the point is we have to push the risk. We have to really focus in on what the patients want and need, what society needs, and depend a little less on what we're accustomed to and status quo of what we've been providing.
That's great. And actually, that leads me to another question around strategic planning, and that is, what are some of those skills that make for successful leaders that are able to implement strategies well?
Yeah, so I think one is just what we said. You've got to have some tolerance for risk.
Right.
Some strategies fail. Some fail, and some boards don't take kindly to failures of certain magnitudes, and so there is some career implementation. I think the second piece of it is self-awareness. For a CEO of an organization to realize that they don't have all the answers, and that they perhaps are not as close to the patient or the consumer as they need to be. And then this ability to, I think third is just the ability to organize people around critical thinking. And I think a lot of times that's what lacks in a lot of these organizations is that we don't have the wherewithal to really get all the right players in the room. And by the way, the right players aren't just the people on the C-suite floor that I see every day. The right players are the people that understand the challenges, understand the problems. And so once a CEO or other senior leaders are able to organize some effort to provide critical thinking towards what does our consumer base need, what resources do we have to meet those needs, and so what's going to be our focus of the deployment of those resources, that's a lot of critical thinking. And to do that, as we've mentioned, very effective if it's an open and honest and transparent conversation.
Yeah.
I
Michael?
would add to that communication skills.
Yeah.
You just cannot over communicate, especially when you're making changes. So those skills are really key to effective leadership.
It sounds like a great list. I mean, I'm thinking about, how we define reliable leadership, and this is helping to kind of create that clarity, right? So first, being able to organize people around critical thinking. And like you mentioned, Rod, the idea here is to create an inclusive group of individuals where people are brought in not just from a diversity play, but from a place where you're truly wanting to include the right individuals in the room. I would say not folks that are in the upper executive level, not people that you can rely on to just tell you yes, but will rely on to tell you the truth, and in sometimes no, and in sometimes hard or critical truths. But you also have the leader that needs to be self-aware. And from our perspective, self-aware of their behavior, self-aware of their perspectives, self-aware of their own kind of approach to the way they lead, the ability to take risk and how they manage risk. And then you said communication skills, Michael. So I feel like all of those components make up what we've been talking about today would be a reliable leader, right? That's it.
And I think, Frank, we've talked on previous webinars about a little bit about your all's journey, from a company that pretty almost went under
Right.
several years ago, and how you address those misbehaviors in your organization. And healthcare is just as guilty as having senior leaders that have those misbehaviors of belittling someone else's opinion or dismissive. Michael mentioned a while ago, dismissive to perhaps a solution brought forward by a nurse, using power and ego to say only the CEO makes those decisions. And I know in your all's experience, that sort of CEO almost was the ruin of the company. And at one point, that CEO was really creating that strategy in a vacuum and was forcibly trying to deploy it through putting people in situations that probably shouldn't have been. I mean, is that kind of your take on where you all came?
That is 100% my take, that it was very much done not only in a vacuum in terms of what needed to be done, but also from the perspective of individuals that didn't have a full understanding of our industry or our people. And, legacy leaders that were brought in from other industries and other parts of the world, as well as our CEO looking outside at how other companies had been run. Now, I don't think he had actually gotten the inner workings of how deals were made and conversations were done inside on a board level, but he was seeing the way that people were supposed to treat each other because that's how it always had been done. And you're right that the reality was it was a very small, very tiny group of individuals, sometimes just our CEO, making those decisions. And it was not inclusive of the needs of the organization. And ultimately, that got us to the point where we were had a kind of a come to Jesus reckoning moment, essentially. And that led him down a different path of recognizing that the way he was leading was not reliable. And it wasn't from a place of care or empathy or respect for individuals. And once he was able to recognize that and begin to change his attitude, his mindset, and the way he communicated with the entire organization, that began a transformation in our company where he began practicing some of the tenets of reliable leadership. And so I've experienced it, I've seen it. And one of the most important things for me, and I think that the both of you will agree, is he also brought us along, other leaders in the organization, on that journey as well. It wasn't just him going on this path saying, I want to be a more reliable, more trusting, more empathetic, more vulnerable leader. It was, I want to do this. Let's all do this together. And as a result of that, that's when it began to echo through the halls. That's when more people began to join in and realize that reliable leadership isn't just the one at the very top. It's the responsibility of everyone inside of the organization. And had he not seen that, we wouldn't be here today.
Yeah. You mentioned early on in the program, Dave, Frank, just sort of the fast pace of IT, and change in healthcare is not that fast unless,
right,
of course, you get a pandemic thrown in there. And so health systems, we generally take a 1-year course of action of we're going to plan, and it'll take us a few months to get going on that, and then we'll look at it again next year. Given the fast pace of IT, do you all use a 1-year planning cycle, or do you break that up, or is it just kind of constant?
I would say that it is constant. And, we've defined some operating principles that we work through in regards to coming up with new ideas. And I think that in this situation, we're having to pivot frequently, more often than I would say even once a year, once a quarter. At this point in time, as we're defining new products and services and kind of creating what we want to create and kind of rebuilding our organization even, we're having to make strategic decisions almost on a weekly basis around not just the products and services that we offer, but everything else for the entire organization. So I would say that in this moment in time, in a pandemic style setting where we had to regroup as an organization, we've also had to expedite the time and expedite the change as quickly as we possibly could to be able to move as fast as we needed to move. So previously, yes, I would say that we were on a slower cycle. I would say that we were, every few months or every year, we'd have strategic planning meetings and we'd talk about where we want to go, and we'd be moving the levers here and there. But we had a meeting last week that completely pivoted. One of the approaches we were taking was something, and our team has gotten to the point now where we've been able to get a little bit more agile with making change and being okay with change coming in almost real time.
So there's a comment, if you bring up the comments on the side, there's a comment about
Craig,
for public health departments to deploy just-in-time strategy to deal with the pandemic, and how can that continue to be practiced? And that's been a question that we've asked and have asked of us, of healthcare systems. The kind of changes and implementations that have been done over the course of a couple days or a week with the pandemic are things that would have taken months to maybe a year in prior planning cycles. And the question is, you don't want to have a pandemic to make that happen. How do you make that? What kind of planning, what kind of leadership do you need to make that more routine? And it's especially crucial for public health. And I think those in public health realize they are truly on the front lines of a pandemic. It is not coming from the CDC. It's coming from local public health departments that have the ability and the authority to make changes on a local level. How can they and how can healthcare systems continue just-in-time planning and implementation? So it's a great question.
I think it also that flexibility requires some flexibility in the structure. During the heat of the pandemic, we did some work with a health system in New York City. And one of their takeaways, one of their learnings was you quickly throw out job titles and you quickly throw out traditional roles, and that every person has the ability to do something new. And so we start to delegate work that has to be taken care of immediately. And so someone that predominantly was a VP of HR, now they're, setting up testing sites or whatever it might be. We have to get very flexible during those trying times. Now, the question then becomes, why don't we deploy that flexibility all the time? Why not have the best player in the best position all the time. And it goes back to earlier comments. We get so stuck in these traditional roles that we really don't allow people to come out of that role and innovate in other areas, or even talk about, if an HR person tries to say something about operations, they might get the response that, well, you're in HR, you don't know anything about operations. Well, that's entirely not correct. That leaders are leaders and they have innovative ideas. And so we have to be very flexible in the structure. The other point I would make for how do we make strategic planning real time is that strategic planning requires certain inputs. And the inputs are, what are the needs of our consuming base primarily, but also what are the competitive activities going on there? What are the financial resources? And so as long as you can capture and maintain the sustainable flow of information that feeds into strategy, then I think you do have the ability and perhaps the obligation as a leader to become more real time. Now, a lot of times what happens is, as a leader, it's tough to say we have to discard that strategy and do something different because it didn't work. I mean, there's some element of admitting failure. There's some career threat there with our boards and others, but it goes back to that sort of courage, courageous leadership, courageous authenticity to say, here's what's really happening, and we need to talk. We need to get it out and talk about it and take action. If it's not working, it's not working. But unfortunately, particularly in healthcare, a lot of times the environment is changing, and healthcare systems are far too slow to pick up the pace and respond to that change.
Yeah, and if you think about high-performing employees, many times it's not just they did their assigned job well. They found new ways to do that job or new way to do new things, and that's how they were recognized as high performing. I'll tell a story of the one of the assistants to Dr. Mark Chasson, who's CEO of the Joint Commission. His assistant, who was sending notifications to hospitals about status via typing, a letter that was typed and then sent by express mail, etc., which was very time consuming and also expensive because you needed a return receipt to make sure the hospital or the CEO actually got it, because it was sometimes good news, sometimes bad news, but either way, it had to go. And she realized that the Joint Commission already had, with its 20,000 plus subscriber hospitals, an 8 o'clock release of a blog of information that was specific to each facility, and each facility is kind of responsible for looking at it at 8 o'clock each day, because it might say that you're going to get your surprise 3-year inspection today, and it's used for those kind of purposes. So she realized that those notifications that they were sending out by express mail could all go there, and you could guarantee that they were actually picked up and read at no cost whatsoever to anyone. That's what, when you allow employees to have that kind of creativity, and the leadership allows it, and Mark, of course, encouraged that throughout the whole organization. Those are the kind of those kind of gains you can't even plan for or order people to make. They will make them with the right leadership. They'll make them spontaneously.
By the way, Brandon, we appreciate your comments. He makes the point that it's not just necessarily out and about with your employees as a reliable leader. You're not necessarily just getting input and learning. You're also there to promote and to exemplify the standards that you're trying to do. So we appreciate that, Brandon. By the way, if you've joined us late, we did have a connectivity problem with Josh Ettinger. We'll have to figure that out later. We did test the link. It worked fine, but then when Showtime hit, it did not. And so if you do have questions, and we're happy to receive those in the comments if you'd like to put them in.
Thank you. Yeah. And thank you, Craig, for your question earlier. And I was going to ask the two of you, through your careers, I'm sure that you've seen quite a few strategic plans fail. or
Yes.
quite a few. Michael's like, you know what? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
I want to ask what causes, and the strategic plan itself was created by a person, right? Or a group of people. So that leads me to ask what causes leaders to fail at strategic planning? What are some of the reasons why leaders are not able to either get through the finish line or able to even do it in the first place?
Well, I think one, and this may be the most predominant one, but Rod mentioned it, and that is that there'll be a new strategic plan, and it may actually be a good plan, but it's a good plan. And well, Rod, you're there, and Frank, you're there, and we're just going to put this strategic plan. You're going to get, Frank, you get a piece of it. Rod, you get a piece of it. Shabbat gets a piece of it, and we haven't changed the personnel to actually do it. Sometimes some of those strategic plans require fresh blood, outside personnel to do it, or reassignment of duties, not just adding on to, I've seen arrangements where very significant new chores were just added to the hospital CEO's job. Well, it's not so easy being a hospital CEO, and just throwing another thing on top isn't necessarily going to work. I've seen it not work.
Yeah, and so in the face of not wanting to totally reorganize the organization to align with the strategy, and by the way, we find that the two things that cause the demise of organization is one is lack of clarity around the roles and lack of clarity around the goals. And so as you bake strategy into that, occasionally you'll have what may appear to be an enlightened organization where they'll say, all right, everybody's got new roles, but we really don't want to change that much. So we're going to have dual reporting relationships. And then all of a sudden you have a matrix, matrix organization that will arise out of that. And so research shows that only about 40% of the matrix organizations that are deployed actually succeed. And it's largely because we call it a matrix, but we don't allow it to operate as such. And so it's possible. But what happens is there's oftentimes a disconnect between accountability and authority. And Frank, you may have been in a position where you're held accountable for some goal, but you don't have the authority to get other people that you need to move along towards that goal. And so this disconnect between authority and accountability is, I think, probably one of the greatest enemies to strategic deployment, in that it's easy for CEO Michael to tell Frank and Rod that, okay, I'm holding you accountable for making this strategy come about, but you don't have the accountability. You don't have the authority to change anything. But I'm still going to hold you accountable for it. And
right.
It's frustration.
It is, and we've heard that as decision-making rights. And in a couple different organizations, they'll use the term decision-making rights and saying, hey, if we're going to be rolling out this new strategic approach, we need to make sure that the right people are in place and have the right decision-making rights so that it doesn't have to be hierarchical across the board consistently. So that definitely makes sense. Yeah,
and that's the hard part. I mean, the easy part is renting a conference room, bringing 300 people together and putting up some cool slides and saying this is our strategy, but everybody leaves the room knowing that they've got work that's piled up on their desk that day that they've got to finish tomorrow. So.
And I think that's also such a hit to morale, especially when you say, hey, we haven't been thoughtful enough to consider what you're currently doing today and what we're asking of you to do tomorrow, right? And so the strategic planning behind the scenes even is so vital to understand the roles that people are playing today and what that will require of them. And like you mentioned, Michael, it could be new blood, it could be restructuring, it could be doing all these different things. But why do you think leaders don't consider or don't see the necessary steps that need to be taken? What are some of the factors that are holding them back from truly understanding what strategy needs to look like?
Well, I think it's very painful for leaders to let go of things that need to be done. I mean, it's one of the, even as simple as one of the things I used to do is at the beginning of the year, I tell all my direct reports, stop sending me all the reports and just wait to see what I ask for. because over the course of the year, people would build things on, and I'd say, "Oh, that's a great report," and they would think they have to generate it every week. And so just stopping things is very difficult for organizations to do. And taking the time to really dig in and understand what people are doing is difficult. In my executive coaching, I always challenge those that I coach to make sure that they have very clear understandings of what their expectations are from their direct supervisor. And I tell them that you're probably not getting close to clearly understanding those until you're really starting to annoy your direct supervisor, because your supervisor hasn't thought about what they want you to do in great enough detail. Well, if you multiply that through the whole organization, all senior leaders don't really have a good understanding of what people are doing, then you can see how people become overworked. We have just this pile on of work that strategy, we've moved from strategy A to strategy B, but we've really not told anybody to stop doing strategy A. There's a tool that Michael and I use in our consulting practices called the Leadership Circle. And one of the things it does is measure this idea of sort of sustainability. In other words, does a leader have a good understanding of what capacity their employees have and how much of that capacity is currently being deployed? And one of the characteristics of a very successful, reliable leader is one that understands the work that they've placed on their team, understands how much capacity they do or don't have, and then has the ability to sort of modulate. Now, for middle managers, it becomes the manic middle, where they're having to catch all the great ideas falling out of the corporate headquarters and then modulate it a little bit so that they're not overwhelming their team, but they're at least still acting like they're deploying that strategy. And so it becomes very, very tough leadership challenge for them to do that. And so one of the characteristics of a reliable leader is somebody that understands that dynamic and understands that before I send something out, a new strategy, I understand what they have on their plate currently, what the competence level, the resources are to do that, how drastically the new strategy might change the roles that they have, and factor all that in. Well, for a busy executive, that takes a lot of time.
Yeah. Sounds a lot like the sunk cost fallacy too.
There's another factor we gotta talk about here. We haven't mentioned it so far, and that is we're talking about healthcare organizations, right? So in those organizations, guess what there are? A lot of doctors. Okay. We haven't talked about them yet.
I know where this is going.
Yeah. And so, but this has got to be factored into planning and to execution. And what's unusual about healthcare compared to most other organizations is that literally all the professionals have advanced degrees. So they've learned a lot about their specialty, whether that is a medical specialty, subspecialty, nursing, critical care, ED, technologists, technology lab, and imaging, and all the other technologists. They haven't learned. Most of us don't get leadership training in school or strategic planning training in school. But we're very knowledgeable, okay? So you can't, the ROD CEO can't just come out with a decree of a strategic plan and say, docs, you're part of it. And so what they have, the docs and the professionals have to be brought into this conversation in a very meaningful way, or it will certainly flop. In a healthcare, you can't make these changes work. I mean, yeah, you could take accounting and billing in the back office and make those work with some kind of a change, but anything affecting the clinical operations, if you don't have the clinical staff on board, it's really not going to work.
So how do we do that? How do you bring in the broad section of employees or a group of employees like physicians to, I wouldn't say necessarily buy in, because you're not trying to sell them something, but you're trying to get them to commit right? And to be committed to it. So what does that look like? How have you seen that work well? And how is it, what advice would you give people that are actively pursuing, trying to get this, off the ground?
Well, one of the other principles of high reliability is deference to expertise. So we need to tap the expertise of the physicians and the nurses and the other professionals in the organization to make a strategic plan work. Again, anything that affects patients and patient care, which is a lot of what healthcare is all about. So bringing them into the planning cycle and circle, bringing their leadership into what would ordinarily be confidential conversations, which of course they have to keep confidential as well. Those are the kind of things that make for success. That's something that a project that I undertook when I was chief of staff at Cedars, and it was also done at Memorial Hermann after I arrived there, in creating a compact or an agreement, not a contract, but a compact, a very simple statement of what, in this case, physicians promise to the organization, and on the other side, what the organization promised to physicians. So there was an understanding. One of those key, there were only 10 on each side. One of those was that the organization agreed to involve the physician leadership in otherwise confidential planning, including recruitments and new programs. And that, so that when those came to fruition with a strategic plan, the chief of staff and the senior physician officers could tell the medical executive committee of all the other physician leaders and all the physicians in writing or however they address them that they were part of the planning. That's how you get them on board.
Yeah, and that's human nature. If people are involved in it, they'll have greater ownership. As Michael alluded to, the scary thing for hospital CEOs, hospital leaders, is that confidentiality. And so a lot of these physicians are practicing on other medical staffs. And so the last thing you want is sort of these emerging strategies to be put on the desk, the slides put on the desk of the competing hospital. But there's really no way around it. I mean, you really have to create that element of trust to get there. One of the mistakes that a lot of times we as healthcare leaders make, and I've done this many times, is fail to recognize the sort of nature of a physician as an expert. And so their expertise has been built over thousands and thousands of hours, and they have a practice pattern in place, and they have ways that they treat patients, and it really builds up a sense of security. They know, if I follow these practices that I learned all the way back in my residency, and I've implemented for thousands and thousands of patients, then I've learned to trust that workflow. If the strategy then comes in and I catch the doc in the hall, hey, Dr. Shabbat, just wanted to mention to you that we're rolling out a new strategy next week. And, we're not going to have this unit, we're going to have this one, and patients are going to be cared for over there. And we're going to outsource hospital care to a hospitalist group. Just thought you should know, I'm sure you'll support it, pat him on the back and let him go. It's totally denies his the confidence he has in his already existing work patterns, his practice patterns. And so if I've not allowed him into that conversation early on, one, I won't know how a new strategy may jeopardize that and actually produce unsafe care, because now we're moving him away from that. It's the sort of the most ironic one is when we as healthcare leaders catch Dr. Shabbat in the hall and say, hey, Dr. Shabbat, finances aren't looking too good. We're averaging 4 days of length of stay. I need you to get that down to 2.5. Well, keep in mind that his practice patterns have filled 4 days, and it's not something that he can flip a switch on. And so we really have to sit down and strategize with the medical staff.
Yep. Wow. So we could talk strategy for a long time. And I think we will probably be talking strategy again, because we want to make sure that we can get Josh back in once we have the technology. Now for today, unfortunately, we weren't able to have Josh join us, but we will in the future, and we'll have a different a different subset of questions around strategic approaches, especially how he engages with strategy at Kaiser Permanente. But I wanted to close us by talking a little bit about how just so many different ways and approaches that we've talked about today around strategic planning really comes down to how a leader operates and how they behave. And that behavior for me is something that I'm taking away from this conversation around the ability to be vulnerable, the ability to bring people in. And vulnerability in this situation is being okay with stopping something or taking a risk to do something else and being willing to communicate to people, even when it's not perfect, right? Even when the information they're communicating may be challenging or maybe something that doesn't show them in a completely positive light. And so, when we're talking about reliable leadership and we're talking about reliable leaders in general, there are so many different attributes that compose an individual to be that person. And a lot of it unlocks the ability to also be strategic and to almost naturally flow that reliable leadership into creating strategy that is inclusive and that is, designed for zero harm for patients.
Well said. Well said.
Agreed.
Well, Frank, we appreciate your flexibility today. We will try to get Josh back on in the future. And we invite everybody to stay tuned as future webinars will continue to look at high reliability and leadership. Some of our upcoming guests include the most recent Baldrige Award winner at a hospital. We have a CEO of Zoo coming on soon, a medical staff leader who's will be joining us soon, as well as a physician and leader from some New York City hospitals to talk about the pandemic experience as well. So lots of great guests coming up, and we appreciate everybody's time today.
Sounds great, Rod. Michael, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.